This week on the Time-Lapse Show, let's analyze some time-lapse shots to make sure we're getting the best framing we can possibly get. Plus, hear my 5 tips for improving your time-lapse framing coming up next. Hello, fellow time-lapsers. My name is Steve Barth. I am your host of the Time-Lapse Show, and this is show number 6 for the week beginning July 22nd, 2018. There's really no new news to report this week, so let's get straight into our subject. It's vital to your success as a time-lapse producer to frame your shots in such a way that it's effective for you as a time-lapse storyteller, and it's also a compelling experience for the viewer. But before we start analyzing shots, let's take a look at where I was when I produced some of the examples for this week's show. Hey everybody, the examples that I'm using this week to illustrate proper framing in time-lapse photography are all coming from here. This is somewhere near Woodland, Utah. We're about an hour outside of Salt Lake City, and just enjoying some family time and some awesome scenery, as you'll see in this week's show. So I thought I'd show you my setup and kind of what I've got going on to film those examples. The one thing to keep in mind is this stuff's not going to look pretty behind the scenes because of some technical mishaps we've had in travel this week. But what I've got so far, I've got a GoPro, a Hero 5. I'm shooting on with a SERP Genie Mini this week. Last week I had the full-size SERP. This week we're using the SERP Genie Mini for its maiden voyage. I did have a slight problem with the tripod in travel, which means everything gets to be duct taped together. But you know what? You got to do what you got to do to get the shots. So it's not going to look pretty, but it's certainly getting it done as far as time-lapse goes. So I'm shooting one camera there, kind of doing a quick pan of this vista. We're going to start, because the Genie Mini, as we'll talk about in future episodes, it kind of gives me a panning motion. It's going to kind of start here, pan all the way over to here by the time the sun sets tonight. So it's a 7-hour shot, and we'll see exactly how it works. On this one, I'm just shooting with my GH4 in a 12 millimeter lens, so that way I can get a nice wide shot of this vista as well. This is not doing any kind of movement. I'll add some movement in post so that it'll still look cool, but that's kind of what I've got going on there. So as far as framing, we'll go through that back in the studio, but as far as looking behind the scenes, as far as where I'm at, what I'm shooting on to get those shots, I thought I would show you those, so that way you can see kind of where this is coming from. So let's get right into my tips for better framing your shots. Tip number 1 is to utilize the rule of thirds. So what exactly is this rule of thirds? It's actually been around for a long time. The first mention of it was in 1797 by artist and author John Thomas Smith in his book called Remarks on Rural Scenery. Now, what the rule really states, and again, when we're talking about rules, we're really just talking about guidelines.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
So what exactly is this rule? Well, the rule states that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines. So you're taking your image and you're pretty much making it look like the side of a Rubik's Cube with just these little squares. So what the rule states is that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines. And then the important compositional elements should be placed along these lines on their intersections. So what this really means is that you can compose shots by putting something either in the middle, in this kind of middle quadrant here, or you can put it on the sides, depending on what you want to do. Now, it's fairly common for people to think that a nicely composed shot has the subject right in the middle of the frame, and that's where that subject needs to be. But it kind of creates a boring, just kind of, it doesn't really engage the viewer is what I'm trying to say. So what we want to do is want to take that subject and we want to either move it to the side thirds, or we want to move it to one of the right on the line. So that way you create a little more space. And what you get is you've got a shot now that is a little more engaging for people. They can see the person that's in focus on the one of the sides, or they can engage with the space behind. And typically the eye is going to go from the subject that's in focus to the space that's in the other 2/3 of the shot back to the subject. And it creates a more dynamic space for your eyes to explore, and thus a more engaging shot. So let's take a look at some of the examples that I shot this last week so we can kind of explain what it is that's happening and you can get a better understanding of how this rule of thirds works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the shot that I already shot over in Utah this last weekend, and I'm going to overlay this guide over the top of it. Now, one of the things that you'll notice that for sake of illustration here is that right here along this edge is the border of the video file. What is out here is all of the stuff that I actually shot, all the content. So what I can do now is I can take this and we can move this around so that we can kind of demonstrate what exactly we want to have in frame. So again, we've got our guidelines. So again, we've got our guidelines up here on the screen so that we can really determine what's going to be best within the rule of thirds within this time-lapse shot. Now, as I've mentioned before, one of the things I really like is a big sky when I'm shooting a time-lapse photo. And so let's really look at how the rule of thirds applies to this. So what we want to have is we want to have a majority of the foreground taking up the bottom third of the frame here. And that way the sky is focused up here on the top 2/3 of the frame. In order for this to really make sense, let's look at the extremes here. So let's say that we really want the emphasis to be on the sky. Well, I could theoretically, if I really want the emphasis to be on the sky, have this all be about sky. So all of this could be a nice shot up here. But what happens when you're focusing too much on the sky is that the viewer is now confused because they don't really have a mental grasp of where this photo came from or where this video came from and what's happening. They see a little bit of the foreground kind of peeking up here. And yes, the clouds look cool, but there's no mental context in what's going on in the image. So this is a bad example of what we don't want to do. So now let's look at the other extreme here. Let's say that we want to have all of this foreground in the shot, all of this stuff down here along the bottom, all the ground. So that could look nice too. However, with it coming kind of in the middle of the shot here, you're adding a lot of emphasis to the ground where there's not a lot of stuff happening. If we scroll through this shot, everything that's looking really cool is up in the sky and not necessarily on the ground. So this is where we really want to make sure that I'm going to set it right down about here so that way the top of the mountains is really coming up along that bottom third. So now when I kind of scroll through the shot, you can see I'm still getting a sense of the scenery, but a majority of the focus in these upper 2/3 is on the sky, which is where I want it to be. And so this is one of the things that I highly recommend doing. Shoot big. We'll talk about this in a few minutes, but shoot big so that way you have this flexibility once you're in post and you're editing to figure out exactly where you want that best shot to be. So here's a few things to keep in mind as you're editing shots and as you're composing them, as you're taking them to begin with when you're out on location. The big questions to ask yourself is, what is the movement that you want to show? And where exactly does that line up in the frame? What is that movement doing? So for instance, in this shot, that movement is coming across, it's kind of this pan across here to the side. And finally, which part of the frame can be filled up the most to showcase what that movement is? So let's take a look at some other stuff that I've shot in the past to really kind of see how this rule of thirds works. Now, the next examples are not from Utah, definitely not. This is a short time-lapse film that I shot 2 years ago down in Disneyland. I wanted to shoot something at night to really show more crowds of people and how these crowds of people float around while also enjoying the scenic look of this. So let's analyze. I've laid the grid over the top of this footage. As I come in here to the beginning of the film, you'll notice that my titles all sit here in the middle of the frame. So that way that the eye goes straight to those titles right at the beginning. Next up is this shot from Disney's California Adventure, and you'll notice that where I set the framing was right on this divider line. This takes the image a little bit off center, and it gives a lot of room over here for the eye to, again, it's going to start here and it's going to move this way as this shot progresses. So now on to another shot. You can see with our grid here, I've got a subject over here. I've got a subject here in the background, but it's kind of where I'm utilizing all the different sides of this particular frame to try to make this a compelling shot, even as it moves sideways. Next up is a quick shot from Cars Land. And again here, I'm going to do the opposite of what I was just showing you. In this shot, the focus needs to be on the people and the movement of the people and less on the sky that's happening up here. And so in order to show that, I've got the people and the scenery taking up the bottom 2/3 and the sky taking up the top. This helps bring emphasis to this particular, again, the people movement as opposed to the sky, and helps to make that shot effective. Here's another one that I did in this particular film. And again, what we've got here is I've tried to have stuff on each side, over here and over here, to balance out the shot. And then so I can keep the people movement in the middle of it. And again, you need to look at your shots. You need to figure out what exactly you want that movement to be, where you want it to be in the frame so that you can compose it accordingly. So here's another quick shot that I did as far as this project goes. Again, what I really wanted is I want the eye to focus on the bottom 2/3. So I've got the main content down here and then a little bit of stuff to frame the shots in the top third. So now that I understand the rule of thirds, let's go to my tip number 2 to figure out how that can help us as well. Tip number 2 is to watch that the frame doesn't become unbalanced. So here's another shot that I was shooting this last weekend in Utah. In this particular shot, I was doing kind of a 180-degree pan from one side of this valley to another. It was taking place over 7 hours, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show. When this happened, you'll notice here that this tree, although it didn't really look this big in real life, because of the wide-angle lens, it looks huge in this particular shot and can kind of be a little bit distracting because it's making the shot feel unbalanced. And so because I can't really add in another tree over here, I've got to try to address this. So what I would probably do, and granted horses got in the way here too, is I'd probably start the shot, in my edit somewhere around here, because then it feels a lot more balanced with that tree now out of the shot. Now, one of the fun things that did take place when I was shooting this content this weekend is I would set up the cameras, as you saw at the beginning of the show. The weather was great. I'd get the cameras all set up. I'd go away for the rest of the day as they were taking their shots. And we're out one night. We're riding the ATVs around the ranch. We're having a good time. And then suddenly this big storm just starts coming in. And we're like, whoa, this is going to be nasty. Didn't really see it coming out of nowhere. But in the time-lapse shot, you can kind of see it as it kind of comes up here. Here it comes across the screen and just blankets the valley in this nasty grayness. One of the fun things as I was out there watching cameras, making sure that my gear wasn't getting soaked or tipping over in a windstorm, is as this storm was raging, we got to this point right about here, and it was really cool. I've never seen anything like it before. Suddenly, almost like somebody had flipped on a light switch. We got this crazy, as you can see right here, this almost like the clouds cleared somehow on the west of us just a little bit to allow the sunset to come in. It happened so fast. It was like somebody flipping on a light switch. It was just poof, on it came. It lasted for, a couple minutes, and then it turned right back off just as quickly. Which, again, when you're taking a picture every 10 seconds, it's pretty much just like, nothing, and then on, and then right back off again. But it did create a really cool effect, which I was grateful that the camera was aimed that direction. Tip number 3 is to identify a focal point and then make sure that that is what's staying prominent when you process your image. So again, let's take a look at what we've got here. So as I'm looking at the shot here, I have to ask myself, what do I really want the viewer to be focusing on? And in this case, what I want people to see is that these clouds weren't just like moving, they were circling, which created a really interesting effect. Couldn't really tell when you're looking at it sitting on the ground with the naked eye, but when you pull this in, what you realize is these clouds are actually circling, which is a really cool effect. So when I'm coming in and I'm adjusting it and working on a post, I want to add movement to the shot to really emphasize what these clouds are doing. So what you can see when I zoom in here is that I'm starting right at the top and then I'm pulling back to reveal that cloud movement, as that's what I want my focal point to be. I want people to be focusing on that cloud movement as it reveals itself so that they can suddenly go, oh wow, those clouds are kind of spinning there. So when you look at this shot, you can kind of see how that works. It's just going to be doing a slow pan out to reveal these circulating clouds. Excuse me. As another example of this, when I look at this, again, this is another shot from another angle of this storm that was sweeping in. What I need to ask myself is, where do I want the eye to be? Where do I want that focal point to be? And let's make sure that we emphasize that. So in this case, I really want people to be looking at these clouds and kind of this imposing sense of doom that these clouds give us. From here, I'm going to be just doing a slow pan up into those clouds. As you can see right here, I'm just focusing everything on those clouds as the rain starts coming down and then gives us that imposing sense of doom. So again, going back to the beginning of the shot, where do I want my focal point to be? I want it to be up here in the clouds. And so that's what I'm setting my time lapse to do. I'm making sure the eye goes up as I want that focal point to be there. So again, the tips for you as you're analyzing your own shots is figure out where you want that focal point to be. What do you want your viewer to be looking at when this shot happens? And then make sure that the movement you add to that shot accompanies that. Make sure that that helps accomplish that goal that you have and that mission that you have. Tip number 4 is make sure that when you do have a little bit of foreground or a little bit, let's assume you're filming the sky like we've been looking at a lot here. When you do have stuff on the foreground, on the ground of that shot, make sure that it's interesting. Make sure that something is happening there. And one of the best ways that you can do that is by shooting low. A lot of times people want to keep the tripod at eye level. But a lot of tripods, you can pull the legs out, you can extend those out so that the tripod gets really low to the ground. And one of the things that you can get when you do that is you can get a little bit, say grass, you can get a little bit of foliage in front of you as the foreground that's interacting and blowing in the wind, whatnot. So that way you can feel, it just helps give the sky a much grander sense when you start off low. And so always look at that. Do I want the tripod to be at eye level? Or do I want to try to go low to capture more of the sky, more of the scenery around? So try that in your shots as well, and you might get some really cool results. And finally, my last tip for really improving your framing is to do just what I was showing you here a few minutes ago in this particular demo. When you're processing files, process them at 8K. Now, that's going to seem, again, like a really big size, but what this allows you to do is once you pull this into a video editor, even though you're editing at 4K, which is crazy big, you still have this room to maneuver around. You can still adjust your shots in post so that you can make the most of them. And that comes from shooting wide, that comes from processing big, and then having those options here in post. So if I want to do a movement that started here and finished up here, I would have enough data in my images to be able to do that. That way you've got what you need to really do the most that you possibly can with these images when you're working in your video editor. So just to recap on these tips for helping you improve your framing. Number 1, remember the rule of thirds. Number 2, watch that the frame doesn't become unbalanced. Make sure everything stays where you want it to. Number 3, identify a focal point and help the audience's eyes go to that focal point as you're intending it to. Number 4, keep the foreground interesting. Number 5, shoot extra wide and shoot with extra detail so that way you have options in post. So that leads us to this week's question of the week, which is, what tips do you have for framing your images? What kind of cool tips and tricks do you have that have helped you in the past? We'd love to hear about those here at the Timelapse Show. So if you're watching on YouTube, go down to the YouTube comments and put those in so that we can share those on an upcoming show. Or if you're listening to the audio podcast version, send us a quick email at show@thetimelapseshow.com so that we can feature that in upcoming shows as well. One of the shots that I found this last week comes from above Earth. Usually we're on the Earth and we're shooting up towards the skies, which give us a lot of cool effects. But this one is in reverse. We're starting at the skies, shooting towards Earth. This is coming from the International Space Station as they took a time lapse and they're filming as the International Space Station is going around the Earth, which gives us a really cool effect. You can see a lot of cool things from this particular shot, so I would definitely recommend you go to space.com, look up the time-lapse video. I will put the link in the show notes and on the video itself, but go check this out and see the reverse of what we're always shooting, which is space to Earth instead of the opposite. It looks really cool. So let's go ahead and wrap up this week's show. Remember, you can contact us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, with the information that's all here below. Send us your questions to show@thetimelapseshow.com so I can answer those in future episodes. If you'd rather call us, you can call our voicemail at 541-321-0472. If you are listening to the audio podcast, remember to leave us a review on iTunes so that way others can find out about the show as well. Thanks for watching and listening. So now grab a camera and go speed up the world. See you next week.